everywhere in the Bible, there's instructions on how to enslave, but there's nowhere in the Bible where it says slavery itself should be abolished. And you can't have both of those. Black people end up doing the same apologetics that white people did about slavery, when in another time, Black people said, we just don't mess with those texts. Those aren't gospel.
Welcome to Great Bible Teacher Interviews. Hello, I'm Rick Jordan, President of Great Bible Teachers. And each week I have the opportunity to interview an author, a scholar, or a practitioner about the Bible, about interpreting the Bible, or spiritual formation. Today I'm very pleased to present to you the interview that I had with Dr. Justin Reed. He is the Assistant Professor of Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, at Louisville Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Justin has his BA from Stanford University, his MTS or Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School, and his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. I became interested in Justin because of an article that he had written about reception history. That's maybe a new phrase for some of us, how the Bible has been received by people and interpreted. And he goes on to call it a history of consequences, that how we interpret the Bible has consequences, some that we hoped for and some that we did not. So that was very interesting to me, so I decided, let's chat about that. I hope you enjoy our interview. Dr. Reed, thank you so much for joining us today, and I appreciate the time and expertise you're going to share with us.
Thank you.
The first question I always ask our interviewees has to do with their own pilgrimage and who has been influential to them. Our ministry is called Great Bible Teachers, and so the question is, who has been a great Bible teacher or teachers in your life?
Thanks, Rick. When I think about great teachers, I have to start personally with my dad. He was not super influential Bible teacher in my life, but he was a teacher his whole life. Taught high school, and then taught Sunday school stuff at our church. We went to an AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. But just the way he taught and the pride he instilled in me and my brothers through the way that he taught was something that stuck with us. But yeah, if I talk about a great influence on me in terms of teaching, I think it would be most fair to my beliefs and my spirit to mention a lot of people, even if I don't have the chance to talk at length about each one. And of course, I'd start with my dad. But in college, in undergrad, is where I really began to have teachers that influenced me significantly when it comes to the Bible, and also when it comes to understanding things about race. And that's because there was a new level of critical engagement that I hadn't had before in both of those. I had some basic understandings, a lot from experience, but not, it was a new, like Pandora's box for me. So in terms of my undergrad, in terms of race, there was Cheryl Brown, Michelle Elam, and Harry Elam, who are married, and Allison Hobbs. Those were the main ones for me. And then in terms of Bible, I didn't have a lot of Bible classes in undergrad. The main person was Stephen Weitzman. And what I appreciate so much, I appreciated him then as a great teacher, but what I appreciate in retrospect so much more is the encouragement that he gave me in light of me now knowing how little I knew. And so I look back and I think, man, I really, there was so much growth left to do. And yet the way he talked to me and encouraged me was as if I was really getting things right. I appreciate Stephen Weitzman a lot for that. And then for my master's program, the professors that I had were huge names in the field. In the field of biblical studies, mostly Hebrew Bible, but I also had Elizabeth Schulzer Fiorenza in New Testament. And she was a great teacher for me because she is not just the first, but the only teacher that I had who was intentional about matching her values, her ethos and her values that had to do with increasing democracy, that have to do with breaking down hierarchical structures. She integrated that into how she teaches. And I thought, as somebody who did well in school the way it was already set up, I thought, oh man, this is different. I don't know how I can accept this. And she won me over completely because of shared values that we have and shared goals that we have. So she's a huge influence for me, even though my discipline in Hebrew Bible doesn't intersect with hers at all, or hardly. That and some ideas about how we interpret the Bible, some ideas of hermeneutics, were huge things I learned from her. And then the Hebrew Bible professors I had for my master's, like I said, huge names in the field. Peter Machinist, Michael Coogan, who people would say, yeah, he wrote the Bible because the Oxford Bible has him as the editor. And then John Levinson, I loved learning from John Levinson. He's such a careful reader, and he is hilarious. He will stand in front of class and do what feels like stand-up comedy for a good 40% of the class. There are things you're supposed to learn. There's a reason for these jokes, but there's long setups for his jokes, and the climax is always hilarious. Many of the jokes you hear the second time and they're just as funny or more funny. So yeah, I love learning from him. And a professor who was new at the time, relatively new at the time, and is establishing his name more and more in biblical studies is Andrew Teeter. And Andrew Teeter taught me, he and I share, I think we both would say this, some basic skills in drawing, not like expert skills or anything like that, but he put those to use in how he taught. And there's certain things that we all learn in historical criticism of the Hebrew Bible that I've never seen taught better than when you can illustrate it like the ways that he was doing. And so because he was able to make those illustrations that were seared in my memory, it was a method that I said, I've got to do my best to apply the same thing. I think that being able as a teacher to figure out what talents go well with certain methods of teaching, the talents you have, I'm sorry, not just random talents that you have that go well in methods of teaching, I think that is integral. If I try to just do stand-up comedy for 30% of the class, I can't do it. That's not my talent. But I could mimic the talent that Professor Teeter has with these illustrations. And if I were not doing that, then I think it would be a loss for my students. So that was my master's degree. And then for my doctoral degree, Dennis Olson is or was my advisor, and he's brilliant person who's also so, how do I put this, so intentional and engaged in feedback. And for me, that was huge. He would, if I had something that I was working on, he would always have, if I gave him a chapter, or if I wrote him an email asking a question, he always had a long and very thoughtful answer that he would send back. And to me, aside from the content, which was great, the message that it sent was that I am invested in your development and your growth. And for me, that was huge, especially as somebody who, for a lot of the time, I was getting my PhD while not physically on campus. So I wasn't in community with these people, seeing them all the time at the library. So having that sort of care in the way he communicated, that's something that I really valued.
Mm-hmm. And
then the other people that taught me there, whose names I don't want to forget, include Professor Xiao, Chun Leong Xiao, who taught me about reception history, which is what I hope we get to talk about today. And then Chip Dobbs Alsop and Jacqueline Lapsley. Those were the main people. And then there were two new professors who I learned so much from. Heath Durrell really engaged with me in some deep conversations about the things that he was introducing me to in class and other things that I was learning in other classes. And the fact that I was at the beginning of my PhD and he had just finished meant a lot of this stuff was fresh for him. And it was just great conversations. I grew a lot, and he's just a great person. He was always looking out for me, put my name in other people's ear in a good way. So yeah, Heath Durrell, and then Brian Rainey. Finally, in my undergrad, I had studied things about race. My embodied experience is such that race is important to me. But throughout my learning about biblical studies, I hadn't been exposed to ways in which the study of race and the study of the Bible intersect until Brian Rainey. And for me, it was just one of those, I didn't know I could do that sort of moments. It wasn't that anyone said you can't do it before, but I just hadn't looked for this type of scholarship before. I had just assumed, hey, whatever people are exposing me to, that is what biblical studies is. And he helped me to see other things. And I think he's got some extremely perceptive insights about how we think of race and ethnicity with precision, and how that study can intersect with the Bible. So I mentioned a lot of people, but they've all influenced me in different ways, and I appreciate them greatly. So I felt like it was it was worth it to name them. So thanks for the chance.
It takes a village to raise a scholar.
Yes, I like that. Raise a scholar, yeah.
And that's really interesting too, how I like the way you, as you've talked about these persons, how some of them were like, oh, I didn't know that, or I'd never been exposed to that. And some of them were almost like the drawing. Again, that was kind of an I didn't know that, but it's also like, I'm already equipped for that. You know, I can already do that, but, and I like the encouragement to consider our own talents, what we can do and bring into the classroom that is our personality and our gifts to our class members. That, you know, the class next door, that teacher's got different gifts and talents, and good for them. You know, I don't have to compete with them.
Yes.
I use what God gave me. Yeah, I love it. You mentioned the phrase reception history, and I know a little bit about that, but it was not something I was exposed to. I think it's a fairly new idea, or at least it's been categorized and brought together in a new way than when I was in school, which was really based more on, I guess, a historical, critical method of how to interpret the Bible. But talk to us about reception. What does this mean?
Yeah. So, Rick, let me do it this way. And I hope through my mind, all these things started racing as you were talking. So I hope I come back to everything I wanted to. I'm going to start with an example. And then I want to come back to the point that you made. So much that we learned is historical critical. So I want to show the contrast. So if you can remind me to come back to it, I want to. Rick, if I said this is a quote from the Bible. For this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and will cling to his, let's say, wife for now. And the two will become one flesh. If I said that quote, you might say that that quote is about what? What would you say that the subject matter of that is?
I would say marriage and
Marriage.
Sexual union makes you one.
You'd probably say marriage and sexual union makes you one. Now, you, Rick, you're born, I don't know when you were born, but I know it was in the last century.
You're right. Get warm.
I know that you have experiences that include Christianity. I know that those Christian experiences include reading the Gospels. Have you heard that quote from the Gospels? Is it ringing a bell?
Yeah.
Just vaguely, do you know where you got it from? That's right. We didn't prepare this.
Yeah.
Really putting you on the spot.
In the Sermon on the Mount, or where I've heard it from exactly.
So if it was the Sermon on the Mount, then you'd say who's speaking?
Jesus.
Jesus. Okay. So it's not actually the Sermon on the Mount, but it is Jesus speaking in Matthew. I believe it's 19, and Mark around 9 or 10.
Okay.
In both of those, it's contextualized after someone asks a question about divorce. Now, you and I and the footnote in your Bible all know that this is Jesus quoting the end of Genesis chapter 2. See, I think it's the second to last verse in Genesis chapter 2. The idea of reception history, one of the big concepts in reception history is that if you or I or almost any of us today pick up Genesis chapter 2 and read that second to last verse, we can't possibly read that without some influence by the fact that it's written in the New Testament out of the mouth of Jesus, and people for centuries, or you might say millennia, have interpreted that passage in Genesis through the light of what somebody wrote in the New Testament. So a certain text has been received. Reception history is this idea that's been received over and over by communities across time, and they've interpreted that text. They've understood its meaning, and the meaning that they've understood gets passed down with the text to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. So now when you see that text, you might be inclined to think marriage immediately. It's contextualized in the New Testament as about marriage. But what if I told you that text says, for this reason, a man will, it literally says abandon, but we say leave, all right, his mother and his father. That's how the passage starts. And if I said, perhaps in studying the Bible, studying the history of the people behind the Bible, you might have heard of the house of the father, the Beit Av. Their understanding of marriage was a man brings a woman into his father's house, doesn't leave his parents, but brings a woman into his father's house. And that intergenerational home with the Beit Av, with the father who becomes a grandfather or a great-grandfather if you're lucky, right? That is where the new family goes into. They don't go out and live alone, separate from everybody else like we do in modern times, right? If I told you that that's their understanding of marriage, then it'd be strange to say this text is really about marriage. It would be like if I told you a story and the climax of the story was, for this reason, two people will exchange rings and pledge vows to each other, you'd say, oh yeah, whatever you just told me the story, that's about marriage. But if I said, for this reason, two people will look deeply into each other's eyes, hatch a scheme, get on a boat, and escape from everyone else, you wouldn't say that's obviously about marriage. It's about something else. It has to do with two people, yeah, but that doesn't make it about marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So in this text, once you realize that reception history, the history of how it's received, inclines you to already think in certain parameters on what this could mean. Reception history can help us to see how we've put on blinders over the history of looking at a text. And I want to come back to that. It can help us see how we've put on blinders based on how the text has already been received. I've heard convincing interpretations that that text in Genesis might better be read as about sex that leads to procreation. A man and a woman leave, as in come out of, abandon, as in are no longer inside their parents. They're new people. So the man's no longer inside his parents. He's a new person. Joins with a woman, and what does he create? Another new person, one flesh, that used to be two different people. Which the story up until that point had talked about one flesh that became two people. Sounds like procreation, doesn't really sound like their practice of marriage, right?
Yeah.
But reception history can put these blinders on us sometimes. That's one way of talking about reception history.
So let me see if I've got it with a little summary. So you've got a text that originally was in Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
The author of a couple of Gospels have Jesus quoting that passage in the context of what about divorce? Jesus has asked about divorce. And so for 2,000 years, we've been thinking about that text in Genesis is about marriage. But when you look at the history of cultural context of what was marriage then, marriage was coming into, not abandoning, marriage was coming into the family. And so there needs to be some conversation about why is that? What's the difference with it? And we haven't had that conversation because we have just made these assumptions, as you said, blinders. Well, we don't need to go into that because we already know what becoming one flesh is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one flesh, I guess I would have said maybe that should have been better interpreted almost like one spirit, like you unite with someone but then when you say, yeah, but maybe it means procreation, it's one flesh having a child and two people had one. Yeah, I mean, it's like lights start going off. It's like, oh, yeah. So I've always heard it this way, but
Yes.
maybe there's another way to see it.
So one direction that one could take with reception, well, so in all of what we just talked about, reception history, the study of reception history is that we actually look at, okay, here's a text, here's one moment in history when it was interpreted, and that moment has had some impacts for later interpreters and late interpreters. You might look at another moment when it was interpreted, and another and another. With reception history, you might find not just blinders, but the opposite. You might find, hey, look at how this person in this one context, 7, 8 centuries after, interpreted this text. I never thought about that before. So looking at reception history that way, what we might say is the biblical text is pregnant with meanings. There's a lot of possible meanings there.
Mm-hmm.
Go through this discipline of reception history, you get exposed to these voices of interpreters who have pulled out, constructed different meanings that are possible in this text. So instead of putting on blinders, looking at reception history is also a way of opening things up. So there's those opposites, potentials. The big contrast to traditional historical critical methods is that historical criticism has been, the term historical in historical criticism, when we talk about it in the more narrow sense, historical criticism has been overly concerned with the history that has led to this text creation, ideas of origins, ideas that different pieces come together, right? And then at some point, a long time ago, historical criticism says, we got the meaning. So meaning is what an author in the 8th century who wrote this text wanted the audience to understand. Anything after that is just wrong unless we can get back to what they thought. Reception history pays attention to everything after the text. Brennan Breed has a book called, I think it's called The Nomadic Text. I forget the title, but I read it. And what he talks about is, hey, there's this murky boundary. If you really pay attention, there's a murky boundary, or you might say there's no boundary, no real boundary between an original text and its reception history. Because these texts are continually developing, and they don't have a solid meaning that stops at one point. If someone copies the text into a new manuscript and there's one letter changed, is that a new text, or is that the old text with an error, right? Every time that the text is passed on, it's nothing unless it has meaning when someone reads it. It's just a piece of paper or a scroll or a codex or a book. The difference between reception history and the history of making the text, that historical critical idea of, maybe you might talk about source criticism or redaction, things that made this text, there's not a real solid, definitive barrier, is what Breed talks about. So that's a wrench to throw in there. But the big thing I want to talk about now is history of consequences. Because when we say reception history, it's easy to let the things we're talking about be maybe a luxury of those in the ivory tower, right? To say, oh, that's interesting, that's cool that you can look into that, right? But when you say history of consequences, you bring to bear the fact that, for example, in Spain, a person named, I think his first name is Juan, Ginés Sepúlveda, debated with Bartolomé de las Casas. They're debating, they're using biblical texts, they're using theology, they're using traditions in Catholicism. They debated about whether the Spanish in their imperialism that they're doing in the Americas should be enslaving Native Americans. Their interpretation of the text is not just reception history. It's not just a history of interpretations. Doesn't really matter. You can study it if you want or not. These are serious consequences for the people, for the Native Americans and for the Africans who end up getting the brunt of the enslavement because of those debates. So it's not, I'll leave it at that. So history of consequences brings that to bear. And the way that I learned it from Siao, when we talk about history of consequences, which is how he names it, I still use reception history sometimes because that's going to be easier for someone to look up in an index. And if, I don't want to confuse people, so I'll use them both. When we're talking about this, it's not just when did somebody write an exegesis paper? When did someone write a sermon? But it's all the types of things that are influenced by this text and come after. The classic example that Siao always gives has to do with the book of Job being interpreted, and he goes from stage to stage to stage until this idea of Job as like a spiritual warrior plays into the Crusades. There's a big gulf between these, but in stages it gets there. So the consequences is a huge part of this, and I think that it's an appropriate term to use for what we're talking about.
So in other words, biblical interpretation then is affected by what's going on politically. You have artist renditions of things that, I think of the first time I saw a picture of Moses with horns. And,
yes.
It's like, why does Moses have horns? And it's, well, I don't remember the details of it now, but, there was a word that was used that was mistranslated, I suppose, horns, or what Moses had around his head when he came down with the tablets. And so even in art, we use that to nurture our understanding of what the Bible is saying. And then I wonder, even like denominations, like, why do we have so many denominations? Well, part of that is probably because one group saw this text as being ultimately more important than another and felt like it wasn't getting the attention that it needed, and someone was very passionate about that aspect and found followers, and it grew, So those are some ideas that came to my mind as you're talking about the consequences and why we gain them.
Yeah. So in my research, I have looked at a story that has had huge consequences, and others have written books about its history directly. Sorry, that's my phone. Others have written books about this text directly engaging with its history of consequences. And that text is Genesis 9, verses, people might put the parameters differently, but I say verses 18 to 29. And this is the story of Noah cursing Canaan, which is often treated as if Noah curses Ham. But either way, this is a curse by Noah that involves language of slavery. And if and when somebody interprets that text and just tries to point to, okay, well, here's what it originally meant, so there you go, that doesn't erase the fact that this text was weaponized by people at different points in history in their denigration of and support of slavery and other types of subjugation of others. Mm-hmm. And it also gets diffused into other arenas, and it's a complex history. The most straightforward is when someone says, hey, look, Ham in the Bible has children in Africa. Mitzrayim is Egypt. Cush is south of Egypt. Further up the Nile. Those are Ham's children. So they'll say, well, Ham is black. He represents black people. Whatever Ham does to Noah causes Noah to curse. And they'll say it should be Ham or it is Ham. And then they'll say that means black people deserve this slavery or subjugation. That's the more straightforward, in my opinion, misinterpretation that is used for this text, or has been used for this text, used in 19th century pro-slavery works. But the ways in which the text spirals in a history of consequences and diffuses are manifold. You see, for example, people trying to affirm their full humanity in spite of white supremacist ideas that black people aren't fully human, have said, we are descendants of Ham. We are historical people like the Egyptians and the Cushites. And then white people in the 19th century, with the developments not quite there yet, with full-blown full-blown scientific racism, they're getting there, are saying, not so sure about that. Some people are saying, no, if there's anyone mentioned in the Bible, they've got to be Caucasian, especially if they're accomplished, like the Egyptians. So then this idea develops, a different narrative that has these white supremacist roots of the descendants of Ham, no matter what they look like, are technically the white race. So you get this hypothesis that the white race is really united by civilization, regardless of skin color, regardless of a lot of features. You might find some subtle features like the shape of a skull, but the things that elsewhere in society we say, oh, that person's black, that person's white, you can't really tell. Only the scientists can tell. Because really what's holding it together, Henry James Breasted, I don't know if I pronounced his last name right, but he wrote the most popular high school textbooks in the early part of the 20th century. And in those textbooks, he's pointed out on a map, here's the great white race. So everyone who's paying attention in high school history class is learning that the great white race includes these people that are in East Africa. And when he describes it, he says, regardless of skin color, the great white race includes people with dark skin. Regardless of skin color, they're white. And fundamentally, this has to do with civilization. So you get these racist ideas that are spinning out of conversations about Noah's children, Ham, black people belonging in the biblical story and in history, reactions, racism feeds into it. You get these other ideas that just spiral out of it. That's all history of consequences. You keep going, and I'm not saying this is in whole, but part of the consequences includes the Rwandan genocide, where two ethnic groups who I think most people who study them today would say that neither of them is some foreign outside infiltration. Neither Hutu nor Tutsi are some foreign outside infiltration. Belgians spoke theories that had to do with this idea that civilization, anywhere and everywhere, is a product of whiteness, regardless of what they look like. So that meant here in Rwanda, in Zimbabwe, in West Africa, anywhere, if there's some structures something complicated in smelting of metal, something impressive. It's a legacy of whiteness. So that means in pitting these people against each other, part of the narrative that they gave was one of them is a Caucasian outsider, is a white outsider, even if they don't look to us white. So in the rhetoric that people used in committing these atrocities, they said, send those scum back up river where they came from. You see how it's filtered into huge consequences. For some way more direct, slavery. You can point to this text and say that. Some more diffuse in terms of how this text has spiraled into ideas cross-pollinated by scientific racism, has spiraled into ideas about history and anthropology and belonging and the justification for violence. So I think history of consequences is a better term to talk about this, and it opens us up to talking about the Bible in all these ways that I think are hugely relevant beyond what did an 8th century author think this passage meant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that continues today, obviously, and will be with us 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years from now. I mean, this idea is that it is, it maybe builds on one another, and maybe there's reactions to it, but the text sometimes becomes almost irrelevant. Once the idea is there, then it is pushed forward, the idea, like what you're saying, civilization equals white. Well, you can't find a biblical passage that says that. So that biblical passage almost has become irrelevant. And now the thought that it was used to nurture that philosophy grows. And to someone who, they may not even believe the Bible, but they believe this philosophy.
Yeah. So I think the big takeaway that I would push for people is, for teachers of the Bible, is that responsibly teaching the Bible is not to interrogate the details of the text devoid of context of interpreters, the interpreter that's there today, the students in the classroom, the teacher, the world around us, to do it as if those things are divorced, I think misses the real relevance and impact of the Bible in the world. Doing it with those things together, interrogating those contexts that the interpreter brings, I think, is crucial in ways where we can be honest about how we impact the construction of meaning. I don't think it's honest to say, I know what this text means, and who I am makes no difference. Anyone would come to the same conclusion. I don't think that's honest. I think we all make a difference. And the things that we've talked about with the history of consequences, with reception history, show how what's come into your development as a person, your history, and the world history around you make a huge impact on when you pick up a text. There's no author to correct you and say, nah, actually what I meant was this. We see these words and we create a meaning. And history of consequence, thinking about the history of consequence helps us to be more responsible when we figure out, hey, what meaning is valuable for me to create? What meanings do I need to intentionally push against, right? So that's one of the big takeaways that I take for faith communities. Yeah.
So a lot of it kind of depends on your place in society too, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if you're in the majority powerful place, and you look at a text and you've maybe got an interpretation. Maybe it's helpful as a corrective, or at least a balance, to say, well, what does a minority, less powerful person say this text means, so that we can get a fuller picture of what it might mean. I'm just trying to think, okay, if I'm a Bible teacher, how do I find this out? I mean, how do I hear a different interpretation?
Yeah. So Wilda Gaffney, she, in my opinion, has some of the most beautiful, brilliantly perceptive, while relevant to those outside of these small, insular academic circles, interpretations that she creates. At a certain point in her career, after a lot of fatigue from what is going on, she wrote in an article, I need to have a hermeneutic, a way of reading, a way of interpreting that is influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement. I can't be a responsible interpreter and ignore that. After writing that article, one of the books that she has published, I recommend to anybody. It's called Womanist Midrash. And to respond to what you just mentioned, one voice that she brings, and that this voice is natural to her because of her experiences, is a Jewish lens that's called Midrash, which this isn't the best definition, but it's good enough for now, I think. An openness to meanings that can exist alongside the text. So when people make a midrash, it might be a story that is in the gaps of the text, precedes a text, or comes after a text, or in the background of a text, or from a character who doesn't get a voice in the text, right? These are midrashim. I don't know how to pluralize it otherwise. Midrashim. And that's what she does in this book. It's also womanist in terms of the ways in which she in particular defines what it means to be womanist. And one of the reasons why I recommend this book is because part of her definition of womanist is that it's accessible to all kinds of people. But other parts of what she talks about with being womanist are affirming the full value of everybody across races, all sexualities and gender identities. But in doing that, she's coming from her own perspective as a Black woman. So that book is a great voice to bring into circles. So I teach at a seminary, so my students are constantly looking for relevance for congregations and other faith communities. And that book is, the readings that I give them from that book are always a hit because students understand the relevance and feel this liberatory power in the way she's dealing with that stuff. And she does that balance. She says, let me create something. Let me make interpretations where people can be refreshed, feel like they're drinking living water. Let me also look at the problematic text face to face and really wrestle with what's there and not try to brush over them or sidestep them. And she does both of those things. And I think people thirst for that. So yeah, that's a voice that I would recommend people bring in. Vincent Wimbush talks about this. He talks about, I don't know if you do you know who Vincent Wimbush is?
No.
So you have true to our native land in the
Right.
background. I think Blunt is the editor for that, right?
That's right.
So Vincent Wimbush has an essay in there, and you can read his essay. He's one of those brilliant people who writes with a level of complexity where you have to read and reread what he wrote. But one of the things that he wrote that was a lot easier to understand was he was trying to talk about the history of how Black people have interpreted the Bible in the United States, and he kind of puts it in phases where certain reading developed or became like central, even though that same way of reading might have continued beyond that phase of time. And what he does with that is he shows you, he says, look, there's what he calls the classic or the canonical type of the real core of what Black biblical interpretation is. And that's a certain way of reading that's very justice oriented. It does what Nancy Ambrose did, which is if this text isn't life-giving, if it doesn't correlate with my Jesus, then I don't need to give it absolute authority like my oppressors are. Mm-hmm. And he points out that for Black people, that way of reading has not been the only way. In some ways, it's been pushed back against by a rise in Black people accepting the fundamentalist readings of white churches. Mm. This growth of more conservative theology, mm-hmm. Black circles, that I wasn't there to experience this, but he says through the late 70s and into the 80s, there's been these changes where, this whole social gospel, black power, things that James Cone talked about, it happened, but it didn't take root and stay central. Mm-hmm. And these mega churches and this proliferation of conservative theologies developed, and then you end up with Black churches who are ill-equipped theologically to profess the justice claims that they believe in with their theology now, because they've adopted a theology that's foreign to the theology that got them there or got us there. Mm-hmm. I thought that was fascinating in seeing, that contrast there. And it's true to my experience, growing up, going to an AME church, and you hear certain things that the pastor says behind the pulpit, and it becomes from our strivings. But then if we talk about the Bible, there's this certain these fundamentals that we're supposed to accept about the Bible, and you'll say, well, everywhere in the Bible there's instructions on how to enslave, but there's nowhere in the Bible where it says slavery itself should be abolished. And you can't have both of those. Mm-hmm. Black people end up doing the same apologetics that white people did about slavery, when in another time, Black people said, we just don't mess with those texts. Mm-hmm. Those aren't gospel. Those texts aren't the essence of the Bible. And that's what she said. And so for me, that to me, not only is that fascinating, but it's helpful when I'm in a different circle than you are, which is a circle of Black people who cling to our Bible and feel that the academic interpretations might pull us away from our roots. helpful for me to be able to say, look, before Ricoeur had this idea of a hermeneutic of suspicion, Nancy Ambrose applied a hermeneutic of suspicion. And we, not some other people, we needed this in order to make this Bible useful for us. So for me, that's been so helpful in Black circles, letting us see, hey, what I'm giving you is not somebody else. This is actually our heritage. Other people have put fancy names on it, and other people have made careers on it, but these ways of reading have been life-giving for us. So yeah, it's interesting how the exact same story and the same lesson in different communities can function differently.
I'd like to thank Dr. Justin Reed for his time and expertise that he shared with us today. If you would like to learn more about other interviews that are coming up, I invite you to go to greatbibleteachers.com and to sign up for our enews. 2 enews go out each week, one on Tuesdays to let you know about an article, a blog article that has been published, and then on Thursday to let you know about the interview of that week. So to learn more and to learn more from these great scholars and authors, I encourage you to sign up so you'll be able to watch these and learn as I do. Thank you for joining.